World War II's deadliest turning points. What textbooks leave out? We think we know this war. Dates, names, a few famous photos. But the decisions that bent the arc of World War II weren't always made at the barrel of a gun. Some were inked in the dark. Others happened in code rooms with no windows. And a few were built out of steel, rubber, and fuel lines no one remembers. This is the real spine of the war, told fast, clean, and without fluff. By the end, you'll see victory wasn't just about bravery. It was timing, deception, logistics, and a handful of mistakes that cost millions. Poland, 1939, a country carved up in a midnight deal. The invasion began at dawn. The deal that doomed Poland was signed at night. Weeks before the first shells landed, Berlin and Moscow settled their differences on paper and quietly drew a line through an independent nation. Germany crashed in from the west on September 1st. 17 days later, the Red Army crossed from the east. Two blades of the same scissors. Poland fought, but the odds were brutal. German columns moved like lightning. Tanks, motorized infantry, dive bombers stacked into a single punch. The Poles had courage, but they didn't have time. A stubborn myth still survives. That Polish horsemen charged tanks with sabers. It makes a catchy insult. It also isn't true. There were cavalry units, yes, mobile infantry on horseback, dismounting to fight with rifles and anti-tank guns. A propaganda photo turned into a legend that refuses to die. For all the smoke and bravado from the West, help was late and thin. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, then settled into a phony war while Poland bled out. By October 6th, organized resistance collapsed. The country disappeared from the map, replaced by occupation zones and a police state that ran on terror. The war had started. The Allies were technically in. But Poland was already a lesson. Announcements are easy, rescue is hard. And the next phase would show a new weapon, one colder than steel. But starvation would soon be used like a siege engine. Leningrad, when bread fell to 125 grams. What do you feed a city when the ration drops below a sandwich? Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. Petersburg spent 872 days answering that question with grit and grief. Army Group North encircled the city in 1941. Finnish forces blocked the rest. The idea wasn't to storm the streets, it was to squeeze them until they broke. Winter made the siege possible and survivable at the same time. The ice on Lake Ladoga turned into the road of life. Trucks groaned across the frozen surface under shell fire, bringing in sacks of flour and bundles of hope. It was never enough. Rations hit 125 grams of bread a day for the weakest. People boiled wallpaper for the paste. Families hid a crust like jewelry. On the other side of the world, a different kind of trap was snapping shut, set with a whisper, not a blast. Midway, how a one-word lie sank 4 carriers. AF is short of water. That single line lured a fleet into an ambush. The U.S. codebreakers in Hawaii were certain AF meant Midway. They weren't entirely sure the Japanese Admiralty agreed. So Midway sent an unencrypted message about a water shortage. When Japanese operators repeated the same short of water line in their own codes, the target lit up like a beacon. The trap was set. Japan planned to draw out the last American carriers. Instead, the U.S. sailed to the rendezvous first. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, American torpedo squadrons attacked low and died badly. They failed to score. But they dragged Japanese combat air patrols down to wave-top level. Minutes later, American dive bombers arrived from high and behind. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were ablaze in 5 minutes of chaos. Hiryu fought back and crippled Yorktown but died the same day. 4 decks gone. Hundreds of veteran aircrew lost. The balance flipped. People remember the explosions. The bigger loss was experience. Pilots who knew how to fight from carriers are not made in a month. Japan never got them back. The U.S. did. Midway wasn't the end of danger in the Pacific. but it yanked the steering wheel. From here on, the Americans chose where to hit. The next time the world watched a city die, it wouldn't be from the sky. It would be room by room, staircase by staircase. The bloodiest street fight of the war wasn't on an island runway. Stalingrad, a city turned into a maze of graves. Maps lied here. Front lines shrank to the width of a hallway. The Volga to the east, factories to the west, and in between a furnace of brick, smoke, and men who refused to give an inch. The German Sixth Army came to cut a river lifeline and smash Soviet morale by taking the city that carried Stalin's name. What they found was a place where air power mattered less and courage mattered more. Soviet units clung so close to the enemy that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without killing its own. The tactic worked. It blunted the advantage that had carried Germany this far. Every day the attacker took another block. Every night the defender took it back. In November 1942, the wider plan snapped shut. The Red Army hit north and south, encircling the Sixth Army along with Axis partners that held the flanks. The pocket formed. Supply lines snapped. Winter arrived with knives. And still the city worked. Factories hammered out shells. Hospitals stitched. Students took classes in basements while artillery walked across rooftops. The Red Army tried to break the ring, failed, tried again, failed again, and finally opened a land corridor in early 1943. The siege ended in January 1944. Leningrad survived, but at a cost so heavy the numbers feel unreal. The lesson? You can bomb a city into rubble. Breaking a city's will is harder. High Command demanded the Sixth Army hold. Airlift promises evaporated in snow and flak. Hunger replaced fuel. Frostbite replaced rotations. On February 2, 1943, the city swallowed the last resistance. The surrender broke a myth that Germany could not be pushed backwards. It also broke the offensive spirit that had terrified Europe. Victory here didn't just save a city, it turned a tide. And yet, even as the Red Army gathered strength, Berlin saved its most expensive gamble for one more summer. Germany's next big swing drove straight into a wall of mines. Kursk, when minefields beat the tigers. After Stalingrad, German planners wanted to prove they could still dictate the war. The bulge around Kursk looked like the place. Cut it off, crush it, regain momentum. But the same pause that let Germany stack tanks also gave the Soviets time to build a fortress. Defense in layers, teeth like a shark. The German attack began in July 1943 with power that should have cracked anything. Thousands of tanks, elite divisions, all pointed at that one salient. Progress came in meters, not miles. Anti-tank ditches, gun nests, and mine belts chewed up speed. At Prokhorovka, one of history's largest armored clashes turned into a blind knife fight in dust and smoke. Legends call it the greatest tank battle ever. The truth is less tidy and more important. The offensive ran out of time and blood. By mid-July, Soviet counterblows hit flanks that were already exhausted. In August, Germany called off the operation. From then on, the Eastern Front didn't just lean west, it moved west, day after day, town after town, like a glacier scraping everything in its path. The war's center of gravity shifted for good. And in Italy, a very different decision would light a controversy that still sparks arguments today. A rumor smashed a monastery older than kingdoms and made the hill harder to take. Monte Cassino, bombing a monastery on a bad assumption. The Gustav Line straddled mountains and rivers and dared the Allies to break it. At its heart stood an abbey that had watched over the valley for centuries. Soldiers on both sides knew the name, Monte Cassino. Intelligence whispered that German spotters were using the monastery. Fear did the rest. Bombers turned the complex into a smoking field of stone. And that's when the hill became almost unbreakable. Ruins make better forts than walls. German paratroopers crawled into the shattered rooms and turned them into fire traps. The Allies threw in everyone, Americans, British, French, New Zealanders, Indians, Moroccans, Poles, piece by piece across 4 battles that ate winter and men. Progress was measured by orchards and culverts. By May 1944, the weight of a multinational plan finally cracked the line. Polish troops climbed into the ruins and raised their flag over rubble that once was a masterpiece. In the early morning of June 6, 1944, Allied troops hit 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword, under cover of ships and sky. Omaha nearly buckled. Other sectors moved faster. By nightfall, the door was cracked open. Then the real work began. Hedgerows turned every field into a bunker. Towns had to be taken house by house. For weeks, the front bent but didn't break. Behind the lines, engineers built miracles. Artificial harbors called mulberries floated into place and turned open water into piers. A secret petroleum lifeline, PLUTO, snaked fuel under the sea, feeding the steel beast that would roll across France. When the Americans punched out at St. Lo with Operation Cobra, the front finally split. The Falaise pocket closed like a jaw. German armies bled equipment they could never replace. Paris rose in August. The West was open. Germany would still swing one last punch in the snow. And across an ocean, a city would learn what liberation can cost when an enemy refuses to leave. Then an island would show how much pain it takes to change the end of a war. Winter forests, city infernos, an island that broke everyone. Endgame whiplash, last gambles, and the cost of victory. In December 1944, the Ardennes looked quiet. That was the point. German armor burst from the trees under low clouds that grounded Allied planes. Columns in white smocks slid along frozen roads, shoving the front west and snapping up fuel where they could find it. In the town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held while artillery rang off stone and people huddled in cellars. When German envoys demanded surrender, the answer was one word: nuts. Days later, Patton's columns arrived from the south, snow-coated and relentless. The bulge deflated. The last German offensive in the west had spent its future. Across the Pacific, the Philippines were living through a different storm. American forces returned to fulfill a promise, landing at Leyte and then Luzon, peeling the Japanese position apart one clutch at a time. Offshore, a naval showdown so sprawling it is hard to picture decided the rest. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Navy was a shadow. But the fighting on land did not simplify. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, turned into a shattered maze. Civilians paid in numbers a city should never see. Liberation was real. It was also ruin. The road to Rome opened, but the cost was ugly. Civilians in nearby towns paid in homes and lives. The Abbey was gone for now, its destruction a decision second-guessed ever since. The lesson was harsh and simple. The fastest solution can be the longest detour. When the channel crossed next, the plan would hide its genius under something far less glamorous than heroism. You can't liberate a continent if your tanks are thirsty. Normandy, beaches were the doorway, supply was the trick. D-Day gets the posters. The beaches deserve them. But the genius of the Normandy campaign wasn't just those first hours under machine gun fire. It was what came next, turning a thin beachhead into a flood of men and machines that couldn't be pushed back. And then came Okinawa, the last step before Japan's home islands turned into a lesson no one wanted. The beaches were easy, the interior was not. Caves, concrete, tunnels, the island itself had been turned into a weapon. Days blurred. Rain soaked everything. Kamikaze strikes slammed into ships at anchor. On land, the lines moved forward one hilltop at a time. The casualty lists became arguments in themselves. The United States lost thousands of its own. Japanese units fought until they were gone. Civilians, trapped between orders and fear, died in heartbreaking numbers. By the end, everyone knew what an invasion of the home islands might cost. Back in Europe, Berlin was collapsing inward. Soviet armies closed from the east and south while the city tried to pretend things still worked. They didn't. The last days felt unreal. Commands issued to divisions that no longer existed. Boys in uniforms 2 sizes too big. Officers drawing front lines on maps, that had nothing to do with the streets outside. Artillery flattened blocks. Metro tunnels flooded. Government buildings became bunkers and then tombs. In late April, the leader at the center of it all ended his own life underground. On May 2nd, the city surrendered. The war in Europe was done. It didn't feel like an ending. Germany broke into zones. A line of mistrust stretched across the continent like a scar. Friends from last month eyed each other like rivals. The next conflict didn't need tanks to begin.